In Ballymun, on the north side of Dublin, Lisa Thompson was the kind of woman people thought they understood. She was 52, a mother of two, a former youth worker, quiet by nature, kind without effort, the sort of neighbor who stayed in your mind because she made ordinary life feel a little softer. She had lived in the area her whole life and had spent more than a decade at Sandy Hill Gardens. To some, she seemed private. To others, she seemed deeply caring. Both could be true at once. That is one of the hardest parts of cases like this. A person can be loved, familiar, and still be carrying struggles most people never see. Lisa called her children her jewels. Even after her relationship with their father ended, they remained on good terms. Her children were living with him by then, but Lisa's attachment to them had not changed. That part of her life stayed clear and steady. Around her, though, other parts had started to shift. In the months before her death, her world had become less stable. There were signs of pressure, signs of risk, signs that the edges of her life were no longer as calm as they once seemed. If you have ever looked back on someone's life and suddenly noticed the warning signs all at once, you know how unsettling that feeling is. Everything looks obvious only after it is too late. The night that ended her life began in a way that felt almost too ordinary to matter. In the early hours of May 9, 2022, around 2 a.m, one of Lisa's neighbors heard banging and strange noises. Not the kind that instantly sends panic through a street, just the kind that makes you pause and listen. When she looked outside, she saw a man in Lisa's back garden carrying bags. He loaded those bags into a vehicle, and the vehicle drove off toward the main road. The neighbor would later knock on Lisa's door 3 separate times, but there was no answer. Another neighbor noticed something else that same night. She heard banging on the wall, the sound of the gate opening, then a vehicle pulling away. When she looked out, a light was on in Lisa's kitchen. At that hour, it felt wrong. People often remember the feeling before they remember the detail. A sound. A light. A silence afterward. And then the private question that lingers for years, should I have done more? By the afternoon of May 10, concern had hardened into fear. Lisa had not been seen. She had not responded. Her neighbor went to check on her again. The front door was locked. The back door was not. Inside the house, the answer was waiting in the rear doorway. Lisa Thompson was dead. Her bedroom had been ransacked. 2 knives were missing from the kitchen. Her body showed the kind of violence that leaves a whole community struggling to absorb what happened. She had been stabbed in the chest 11 times. 6 of those wounds pierced her heart. There was blood around her nose and mouth. A cord from a window blind had been wrapped around her neck. She had been strangled as well as stabbed. The attack was frenzied, close, personal, and final. Outside, word spread fast. Emergency vehicles drew people into the street. Neighbors gathered, stunned, trying to match the horror inside that house with the woman they thought they knew. Many could not make those 2 images fit together. Lisa was not seen as violent. She was not seen as reckless. She was seen as vulnerable only in the human sense, the way anyone living alone can be vulnerable. Yet the scene inside her home suggested something more complicated than a random break-in and more intimate than a simple theft. The question began forming immediately, even in people who did not want to say it out loud. Who comes into a house like that, kills a woman with that level of force, and then walks back out carrying bags? There were items missing from the home, including Lisa's wallet and jewelry. The room had been trashed badly enough to suggest robbery. But there were no signs of forced entry. That detail mattered. Lisa had a reputation for being careful about who she allowed inside. A neighbor had even seen her locking the back gate behind her in the early hours on other nights. So the house presented 2 competing truths. One version of events looked like a robbery. The other looked like access granted to someone already known. If you think danger always announces itself at the door, this case pushes hard against that comfort. Sometimes the worst person in the story is standing in a place that once felt familiar. The deeper search into Lisa's life revealed another layer. Hidden in the attic were prescription tablets worth around €50,000, stored in 2 large bags. There were claims that tablets had been sold from the house, small amounts at a time, to a handful of local buyers. Suddenly, the image of Lisa that the community held began to split. There was still the warm, generous mother. There was still the helpful neighbor. But there was also a woman whose life had become chaotic enough to draw in people and dangers she could not control. That does not erase sympathy. It deepens the tragedy. People do not stop being human because their lives become messy. They often become more exposed to harm. A vigil was held as the shock settled over Ballymun. Candles were lit. A book of condolences filled with messages. Women in the area were frightened, not just saddened. When a woman is attacked in her own home with this kind of violence, fear becomes communal. It moves from house to house. It sits in kitchens after dark. It turns simple habits into rituals. Doors are checked twice. Curtains are pulled sooner. Every unfamiliar engine outside sounds a little louder. Then the timeline began to sharpen. CCTV traced a Hyundai traveling into Sandy Hill Gardens at 2:28 a.m. A woman was driving. A man sat in the passenger seat. At 2:50 a.m., the man was seen leaving Lisa's house through the back door carrying something with him. He got into the waiting vehicle. Together they drove away. At 3:04 a.m., the same car pulled into the Apple Green service station on St. Margaret's Road. The man remained in the passenger seat, going through a red wallet and a red pillowcase, taking out items and putting them into his pockets. A little later, he stepped out and approached the hatch, where he tried to sell jewelry and rings for €800, claiming the items were worth much more. He appeared energized, almost pleased with himself, despite the hour and the obvious strangeness of the moment. A worker noticed tattoos of doves on the man's hands and came away with a strong sense that something was deeply wrong. For around 40 minutes, the man and the woman stayed there, seeming to clean or shake out the mats from the car, as though they were dealing with traces of a night they could not quite outrun. The car left, then returned 24 minutes later. The woman got out and opened the boot. The man moved into the driver's side and appeared to be holding something. At 4:48 a.m., the vehicle drove off again. It was a sequence so calm on the surface that it almost felt unreal. A woman had just been murdered. Yet here were 2 people moving through the city at night, handling stolen property, stopping for routine movements, acting with the casual rhythm of people convinced they still had time. That Hyundai led the story forward. More footage tracked it to the Clayton Hotel near Dublin Airport. Lisa's driving license was found on a slip road on May 10, in an area the car could easily have passed through. A search of wasteland beside the Apple Green station uncovered Lisa's keys and medication in her name. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were beginning to form a line. That line led to Brian McHugh. 2 officers who knew the area well recognized him from CCTV. They knew him from years of contact, from his build, his tattoos, and the distinctive way he walked. It was not a face in the crowd to them. It was a man already familiar for all the wrong reasons. And Brian McHugh was not a stranger to Lisa either. He had been involved with her before, a casual fling that had faded, then resumed a couple of months before her death. Suddenly, the absence of forced entry looked less like mystery and more like access. Brian's past was heavy with warning signs. He had 50 previous convictions, including theft, burglary, robbery, drug offenses, possession of a knife, and criminal damage. This is the point where many people feel the story lock into place. The violent man did it. The obvious suspect was the killer. But cases like this are often more disturbing than simple. The reason is not that the truth becomes unclear. It is that the truth becomes painfully clear in a way that people wish they had recognized sooner. A search of the home where Brian was living with his mother uncovered some of Lisa's missing jewelry in a bedside locker drawer, with Lisa's DNA on it. A red pillowcase was found there too. Lisa's bedding had been mainly red. In the footage from the service station, Brian had been seen rifling through a red pillowcase and a red wallet. A jewelry valuation certificate and a parking stub from the Clayton Hotel were found in the car, carrying his fingerprints. Most damaging of all, his DNA was found on the blind cord used to strangle Lisa. Brian did not deny being the man on the footage. He gave no account that broke the pattern forming around him. And still, one crucial fact remained. He had not been there alone. The woman in the Hyundai was eventually identified as Deirdre Arnold. At one time, Deirdre had worked as an addiction counselor. By the time Lisa was killed, her life had moved into a much darker place. She had been in a relationship with Brian and had become addicted to crack cocaine and heroin after meeting him. Their relationship was violent. She had sought an interim barring order against him. In one earlier incident, he had broken her arm. He had threatened her life. The control in that relationship was brutal, unstable, and impossible to separate from what happened next. After Lisa's murder, Deirdre checked Brian into the Clayton Hotel near Dublin Airport. She also allowed her vehicle to be used in the disposal of items taken from Lisa's home. Weeks after the killing, text messages connected to her phone described a fear that she could have ended up like Lisa, strangled and stabbed. Other messages referred directly to Lisa's murder and to the knife. The language in those messages carried details that had not been publicly known at the time. That is where the case took on a different emotional shape. Not just one violent man, but a second person near him, beside him, driving him, helping him after the fact, later describing him as a danger to women while still remaining tied to him. Some people see Deirdre as another victim in Brian's orbit. Others see a woman who had a choice and made the wrong one. That debate still stings because both truths can feel uncomfortably close to each other. And that is the part of this story that unsettles people in a deeper way. When fear and complicity live in the same person, where do you place the blame, and where do you place the pity? Most people want a clean line. This case never really offered one. As the legal process moved forward, one argument centered on what Lisa's home had become in the months before her death. One side presented Brian as a violent offender who murdered and robbed a woman he knew, then tried to profit from her belongings within hours. The other side argued that Lisa's life had grown complicated, that people came in and out at odd hours, that the back gate was known, that there was no forced entry because the house had become part of a wider and murkier network. In that view, the killing could not be understood as a simple attack by one obvious man. It is a familiar temptation in true crime to assume complexity always means uncertainty. But complexity does not erase responsibility. Sometimes it only explains how a predator found room to move. The evidence against Brian was not a single dramatic moment. It was a chain. The CCTV from Sandy Hill Gardens. The service station. The hotel. Lisa's jewelry in his home. His fingerprints in the car. Her belongings discarded along the route. His DNA on the ligature used to strangle her. And beneath all of it, the fact that Lisa knew him well enough to let him close. That detail may be the hardest one for people to sit with. Her children had known him too. He was not just a face from outside. He had laughed in that house. He had moved through it before. He had been trusted inside the same space where Lisa was killed. At trial, the defense leaned heavily on the idea that Brian's DNA on the blind cord could have come from previous visits, because he had been in and out of her home over time. But the force of the case came from accumulation. A single trace can be explained away. A trail this dense cannot. Even the attempt to sell the jewelry in the middle of the night carried its own terrible clarity. There are crimes of panic. There are crimes of rage. And then there are crimes followed by behavior so cold, so practical, that the violence seems to continue long after the victim is gone. On February 27, 2025, after deliberating for just under 3.5 hours, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict against Brian McHugh for the murder of Lisa Thompson. For Lisa's family, the verdict did not close the wound. It only named the person who caused it. Her mother and sister had sat through the trial with remarkable dignity. Her loved ones had arrived determined to stand for her voice because Lisa no longer could. In the statements that followed, the case shifted away from exhibits and timelines and back toward the people left behind. Lisa's daughter had been 12 years old when her mother was killed. Her son carried the same rupture in a different way. Their words laid bare a pain no sentence can repair, the loss of a mother, the betrayal of trust, the knowledge that someone once welcomed into their home had turned that home into the place where everything broke. On March 10, 2025, Brian McHugh was sentenced to life in prison. Then came Deirdre Arnold's trial. She was accused of impeding Brian's apprehension and prosecution and of perverting the course of justice. Her defense rested on fear. Brian had abused her. He had threatened her. A month after Lisa's murder, he broke her arm. In messages to him, she described him as someone who had tried to kill her too. Those details were real. But so was the other reality. She had driven him that night. She had waited outside for well over an hour. She had taken him away afterward. She had remained connected to the aftermath of the killing in ways the jury could not ignore. She denied knowing he was going to commit murder and denied knowing he had done it until much later. The jury did not accept that. They found her guilty of being the getaway driver on the night Brian McHugh killed Lisa Thompson. At sentencing, Lisa's daughter's words struck at the center of the case. Fear, she said in substance, did not make Deirdre innocent. Choice still existed. That is the moral pressure point many people return to in this story. Maybe Deirdre was terrified. Maybe she had been broken down over time. Maybe both are true. But the car still waited outside. She received a 3-year sentence, with the final 12 months suspended. By then, the legal story had reached its ending, but the emotional story had not. It never really does. Lisa Thompson remained what she had always been beneath every courtroom argument and every rumor attached to her name, a mother who loved her children deeply, a woman from Ballymun whose life had become tangled in danger, and a person whose final moments were marked by extraordinary violence in the one place that should have held safety. There is a common assumption in cases like this that the victim must fit one simple role for people to fully grieve her. Purely innocent. Entirely predictable. Easy to explain. Lisa resists that. Her life held warmth and complication. Loyalty and vulnerability. Love for her children and choices that brought risk closer to her door. Some people are uncomfortable with that kind of truth because it denies them distance. It suggests that harm does not only visit perfect lives. It visits human lives. And maybe that is why this case lingers. Because beneath the CCTV, the discarded keys, the red pillowcase, the hotel receipt, the jewelry, the blind cord, and the verdicts, what remains is something many people recognize without wanting to admit it. A woman can be surrounded by familiar streets and still be in danger. A person can be known and still not fully seen. A neighbor can hear a noise in the night and spend years replaying it. A child can lose a mother not to a faceless stranger, but to someone once allowed through the gate. Lisa's story ended in Sandy Hill Gardens, but the shock of it spread far beyond that doorway. It moved through her family, through Ballymun, through every person who heard the details and felt that quiet shift inside themselves. The shift that happens when a case stops feeling distant and starts feeling possible. Not because it is common, but because it is human. Lisa Thompson should have had more years, more time with her children, more ordinary mornings, more chances to step out of the darkness that had gathered around parts of her life. Instead, her children were left with a trauma that would shape them forever, and a memory of their mother that now sits beside the knowledge of how she died. That is the final cruelty in this case. Not only that Lisa was killed, but that the people who loved her most must carry both versions of her at once, the woman who loved deeply, and the woman whose life ended in terror. The verdicts brought accountability. They did not bring her back. What they did leave behind was a settled truth. Lisa was killed by someone she knew. Another person helped him leave. And a family now lives with an absence that no sentence can fill, only name.